Tonight, we begin with a development that senior NATO officials had feared, dismissed, and ultimately failed to prepare for. A move that unfolded not over months of diplomatic deterioration, but in a single televised address from the Kremlin. 30 minutes that sent shockwaves through every capital in Europe. 30 minutes that forced emergency sessions at NATO headquarters in Brussels. 30 minutes that may have fundamentally altered the security architecture that has protected the Western world since 1949. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that American and European leaders had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, NATO did not hesitate. They responded with unity, urgency, and unprecedented coordination. But here's what nobody's telling you. The 30-day ultimatum Putin just issued isn't really about what he's demanding. It's about what he's testing. And if NATO fails this test, the alliance that won the Cold War may not survive the next month. Let me explain what's actually happening here. For 18 months now, there had been signals, not official communications, not formal diplomatic channels, just signals that the Kremlin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a predictability. Western intelligence agencies had grown accustomed to reading his patterns. The military exercises that preceded invasions, the propaganda campaigns that softened domestic opinion, the diplomatic pretexts that provided cover. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this week was that the pattern went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian state media know the indicators. The coordinated messaging across RT, TASS, and Sputnik. The sudden uptick in military-themed programming, the rehearsed talking points from Kremlin spokespeople, the sudden disappearance of dissenting voices from public discourse. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. What happened next exceeded even the most pessimistic scenarios that NATO planners had gamed out. Early Monday morning, European intelligence services detected what they described as unusual encrypted communications traffic between Moscow and Russian military installations across the Western Military District, including activation codes that had not been transmitted in over 3 decades. These are the kinds of protocols that Russia only uses when they are signaling something very specific: imminent military action, strategic repositioning, or a fundamental shift in their posture toward the West. NATO analysts didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all 3 at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing Russia's strategic stance. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by small measures, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. Then came the address. At precisely 8 p.m. Moscow time, Putin appeared on state television. No advance notice. No diplomatic preparation, just a direct message to the Russian people and, by extension, to the world. His demands were stark. First, NATO must withdraw all military infrastructure installed in member states after 1997. That means Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, essentially every country that joined the alliance after the Cold War. Second, NATO must provide legally binding guarantees that Ukraine and Georgia will never be admitted to the alliance. Third, all NATO exercises within 300 kilometers of Russia's borders must cease immediately. And here's the part that made officials across Europe reach for their secure phones. Putin gave NATO 30 days to respond. 30 days. Not a negotiating position, not an opening gambit, an ultimatum. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, briefing after briefing, described Putin's move as destabilizing, unprecedented in the post-Cold War era, and perhaps most importantly, a direct challenge to the foundational principles of European security. The Kremlin strategy was clear. Issue demands so extreme that they would expose divisions within NATO, force member states to choose between confrontation and accommodation, probe for weakness. But that strategy only works if the target hesitates. NATO did not. In fact, their response today was among the fastest and most unified we've seen since the alliance was founded. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of Putin's address, NATO Secretary General convened an emergency session of the North Atlantic Council. These weren't routine consultations. These were Article 4 discussions, the formal mechanism member states invoke when they believe their territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. Article 4 has only been invoked 7 times in NATO's entire history. Today made it 8. Tonight, the Pentagon confirmed that the United States has begun repositioning assets across Eastern Europe, including additional fighter squadrons to Poland and Romania that had been scheduled for deployment only in the event of a major escalation. The repositioning began before Putin finished speaking. That tells you everything about how seriously Washington is taking this. They reinforced the Baltic air policing mission. They activated additional naval assets in the North Atlantic. They expedited delivery of air defense systems that had been promised to frontline states but not yet delivered. In other words, the United States targeted the gaps in NATO's eastern flank, the vulnerabilities that would have been exploited if Russia moved first. This is what made the White House warning so urgent. Putin's ultimatum wasn't just rhetorical, it was accompanied by concrete military movements. Satellite imagery analyzed by Western intelligence agencies showed additional battalion tactical groups moving toward the borders of Estonia and Latvia, increased naval activity in the Baltic Sea, reactivation of air bases in Kaliningrad that had been dormant for months, movement of tactical nuclear-capable systems to forward positions. It represented the kind of posture that could transition from threatening to operational within days if left unchecked. And NATO, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't issue empty condemnations. They didn't call for meaningless negotiations. They reinforced the positions that Putin was threatening. They signaled that any military action would be met with collective defense. And here's where the story becomes even more dangerous. Intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's ultimatum was designed to test the cohesion of NATO after years of internal disagreements over burden sharing, strategic priorities, and relations with Russia. Putin wanted to see whether the alliance would fracture under pressure, whether Eastern European members would be abandoned by their Western allies, whether the United States, distracted by domestic politics and competing priorities, would really risk conflict over countries that many Americans couldn't find on a map. But instead, the opposite happened. NATO didn't splinter. They unified with a speed and determination that was so immediate, so comprehensive, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But today, NATO did. Defense officials speaking with major news outlets under anonymity described Putin's ultimatum as a gambit, a way to reshape European security without firing a shot. But NATO proved today that they remain both committed and capable. Their response was not only swift, it was coordinated so precisely that member states issued near identical statements within minutes of each other. That level of coordination matters because it shows something Putin didn't expect. It shows that NATO is not a paper alliance. They are a military reality. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of NATO's response. The United Kingdom announced acceleration of its military support package to Poland, including advanced air defense systems and additional troop rotations. Germany, which has been criticized for hesitancy in the past, authorized deployment of additional Bundeswehr units to Lithuania under the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group. France activated elements of its rapid reaction force and placed them on heightened alert status. Canada announced extension of its military training mission in Latvia with additional personnel and equipment. This wasn't just diplomatic posturing. This wasn't just carefully worded statements. This was military mobilization. This was collective defense in action. And collective defense is the one thing Putin has struggled to fracture since the invasion of Ukraine began. For every pressure campaign he has mounted, NATO has countered with something that strengthened rather than weakened the alliance. The 30-day ultimatum was supposed to be different. It was supposed to force impossible choices. Instead, it forced unity. Remember, Putin thought the invasion of Ukraine would take 3 days. He thought Kyiv would fall and the West would accept a fait accompli. He thought NATO would prove itself a relic of the Cold War, incapable of responding to 21st century challenges. He thought economic interdependence, particularly European dependence on Russian energy, would prevent any meaningful response. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. NATO is more unified than it has been in decades. European nations are increasing defense spending at rates not seen since the 1982nd, and the United States, despite domestic political divisions, is reinforcing its commitment to collective defense. Putin's own actions have achieved what generations of American diplomats could not: a Europe that takes its own security seriously. What makes this moment so precarious and so consequential is that Putin's ultimatum happened at a time when he is under mounting pressure from multiple directions. Russian military bloggers want faster, more aggressive action in Ukraine. Economic elites want sanctions relief and access to frozen assets. Nationalist hardliners want escalation, including potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. Pragmatists within the system want an off-ramp that allows Russia to claim victory without further costs. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a military campaign that has cost hundreds of thousands of casualties and achieved none of its original objectives. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The 30-day ultimatum is not a sign of Russian power. It's a sign of Russian desperation. And desperate leaders make dangerous decisions. NATO's official statement, now distributed to member governments and released publicly, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to negotiate under threat. Officials said plainly that Putin's demands were inconsistent with the foundational principles of European security and the sovereign right of nations to choose their own alliances. That is diplomatic language for no. Not let's discuss this. Not we understand your concerns. Just no. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. The statement continued, any military action against a NATO member state will be met with a collective response. Article 5 remains the cornerstone of our alliance, and our commitment to it is absolute. Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. Those are the words that have prevented great power conflict in Europe for 75 years. Tonight, they were invoked not as a historical principle, but as a present reality. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General addressed the North Atlantic Council in a direct, uncompromising speech tonight. He said, we will not be intimidated, we will not be divided, and we will not compromise on the security of our member states. He said, Russia's demands are not a basis for negotiation. They are an attempt to turn back the clock to an era when great powers dictated terms to smaller nations. That era is over. And he said, our response will be measured but firm. We seek no conflict with Russia, but we will not accept ultimatums that threaten the security of our citizens. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from an alliance that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's ultimatum wasn't isolated. Along with the 30-day deadline, Belarus announced joint military exercises with Russia along the Polish border, including deployment of tactical missiles. Russian naval vessels entered the English Channel in what the Royal Navy described as a show of force. Cyber attacks targeting government systems in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania increased by 400% in the 48 hours before Putin's address. Russian state media began running programming about NATO aggression, nuclear preparedness, and the justice of Russia's cause. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This isn't an isolated provocation. This is a coordinated campaign. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing a limited military action against a Baltic state, testing whether NATO would actually invoke Article 5 for a small ally. Another is that Putin is attempting to create conditions for negotiations, using the ultimatum as leverage to extract concessions on Ukraine. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to shatter the alliance by forcing member states to choose between war and accommodation. But today, NATO took that card off the table. They didn't waver. They didn't hedge. They didn't issue carefully calibrated statements designed to leave room for retreat. They responded with unmistakable clarity. The alliance holds. What we're watching now is a test of collective will. Putin wants to see whether NATO will fracture under pressure, whether decades of alliance building can be undone by a single ultimatum. NATO wants to show that collective defense isn't just a phrase in a treaty, it's a reality backed by military power and political commitment. Washington wants to prevent any miscalculation that could lead to direct conflict between nuclear powers, and Moscow wants to reshape European security without having to fight for it. The next 30 days will determine which vision prevails. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian military movements in real time. They say troop concentrations near the Baltic borders have increased but have not yet reached levels that would indicate imminent offensive action. They say Russian naval assets are positioning in ways consistent with either exercise, activity, or preparation for blockade operations. And they say Putin's decision to issue a public ultimatum is likely part of a broader psychological campaign intended to create fear and division within NATO. But NATO is not retreating. In fact, NATO is advancing. Their response today, unified, immediate, and backed by military movement, sent a message to Putin that the alliance will not be bullied, and it sent a message to the world that collective defense remains the most powerful force in international security. As the 30-day countdown continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this ultimatum. But what we do know is that NATO's response was timely. It prevented Putin from exploiting divisions. It reassured frontline states that they would not be abandoned. And it demonstrated to the world that the alliance forged in the aftermath of World War II remains capable of meeting 21st century threats. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the coming weeks. If he backs down, this moment will be remembered as the ultimatum that strengthened NATO rather than shattered it. If he escalates, NATO has already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are unified. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in years, the Kremlin appears to be reconsidering. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he should have understood long ago. NATO is not a paper alliance. NATO will not be divided by ultimatums. And NATO will defend every inch of Allied territory. This story is far from over. The clock is ticking. 29 days remain. But tonight, one thing is clear. The alliance holds. The commitment is real. And the 30-day ultimatum may have just made NATO stronger than ever. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.